forgot to make you guys co-hosts also in case something happens to me. Hi, everyone. We're just getting started and letting people in. And I'm going to share my screen and then we'll get started. All right. So hello, everyone. Tonight we are going to be going over creating the best growing conditions in your high tunnels. And we always put the date on here. I never know why we have the date on here, but somebody else usually puts it on there, so I always do it too. But in case you forgot, it's February 11th. It's Tuesday night. Welcome to a wonderful Tuesday night in the middle of winter. I hope we all had a good weekend. So I am Emily. I work at New Entry Sustainable Farming Project, and our mission is to foster resilience in local, regional, and national food systems by training a new generation of farmers to produce food that is nutritious, culturally connected, and accessible to all individuals. We have three major areas that we work in. The first one is farmer training, which is part of what we're doing tonight. We also have a food hub that works on food access projects. And then we also have a national outreach team that helps to connect incubator farms around I was going to say the world, but mostly around the United States to help them become better incubator farms. And it's pretty nice. So we've got a lot of people here tonight. I'm always curious about who's here and where they're coming from. So you can rename yourself and add your pronouns if you'd like. And then if you could add to the chat your name, your pronouns, your farm name, and where you're located. I'm waiting to have someone from Alaska come. I'm really hoping that somebody is here from Alaska tonight. So if you are, please make sure that you tell me because I would be very excited. Please mute yourself unless you have a question. If you do have a question, feel free to take yourself off mute and ask, or if you have any questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat. And I am a professional at interrupting people and asking questions, so I am happy to ask questions for you. This meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. If you do not want your image to be shared, please turn off your camera. I know it's a Tuesday night and you must all be tired, so if your camera is off, that's fine. But also it is kind of nice for us to see your faces. I know I'd like to see faces to see if my stupid jokes are landing or not, or if anyone's finding them funny, or just to know to kind of get an idea of whether or not you're getting what we're talking about or not. If there's a lot of lost faces, then usually we can stop and try to make things a little less confusing. Or if you're just smiling, that's good to see your smiling face. But also if you're eating dinner, don't feel like you have to have your camera on while you're eating dinner. Surveys. This workshop is essentially funded by surveys. I guess it's funded by grants, but the grantors that we get money from like to know whether or not we're helping people or not. So there's going to be a quick survey at the beginning of the workshop that I'll pull up in a second, and then there'll be a survey at the end of the workshop. I make the surveys super, super quick. They help us help you, and it's part of how we fund the workshop. So if you like having free workshops, please fill out the surveys. I beg you. I will probably remind you again at the end. And if you are like, oh, another survey, just think of Oprah like yelling at you and going, you get a survey, you get a survey, you get a survey to make yourself feel more excited. But they are really quick and it really does help us know if we're helpful or not, or if we have other things that we should be doing in the workshops, or if I need to be a better host. Even if you hate it, please let me know. It's good for me to know. All feedback is relevant. Yeah. So I'm going to pull up the first survey. It's going to be a very quick one. Just how much experience you have working with high tunnels. If you have no experience, you've never used a high tunnel. If you're a beginner, you've done some high tunnel growing and you're still learning the basics. If you're intermediate, you're advanced, or if you are an expert. And if you're an expert, feel free to chime in if you have some ideas too, because I'm always learning from farmers and I love what other people have done. So I'll give you guys a minute to fill that out and then I'll share it out afterwards just so that we can kind of see where we're all at. And apparently now I'm drawing on my survey thing. Great. And now I can't, well, I guess that line's gonna be there now for the next couple of slides. Let's see if I can delete it. There we go. Uh, Today is only one of many workshops that we're hosting on high tunnels. The ones that we've already had are up on YouTube on the New Entry YouTube website so that you can watch them if you missed them before. We have three more workshops after this one. The next one's going to be on managing pests in your high tunnels. And at the survey that pops up when you're done with this workshop, the last survey will pop up once you close your Zoom screen in a browser window. And the last question on that one is just, what do you want to learn about managing pests in your high tunnels to help us figure out what we should be presenting on for the next workshop? So it'll be very helpful for us. And then we'll have diseases and then also exploring new markets and keeping good records. And New Entry is busy. We have a bunch of other workshops coming up too. We're going to be doing a high tunnel tour at Farmer Dave's. He's got about an acre under cover. He's got radiant heat in some of his greenhouses, and he's got a lot of cool stuff going on there. So it's going to be a lot of fun. It's in Drake, Massachusetts. And we also are hosting a workshop on writing a food safety plan and giving feedback to people's food safety plans that they have written. This is a two-part workshop. It's the second part. If you missed the first part, the recording is up on YouTube, and I can share that out later if you all are interested. It's going to be a lot of fun. As food safety, if you think food safety is fun, I think it's fun. And we try to make it a lot easier to make a food safety plan than it already is. And then the other workshops on high tunnel production are on the second Tuesday of every month until May. Oh, that's not the right one. So we also have a benchmarking study where you can get paid to share your financial records. If you have a good set of like financial records, if you use QuickBooks or if you just like know your farm's finances, we can pay you to participate in this study. We're looking for small scale vegetable farmers that have more than 2 years of growing experience to participate in the benchmarking study. And when you participate, we will give you a report of how your farm's finances compare to other farms that are kind of similar to yours, which is pretty cool. USDA has a lot of information about large scale crops like soy and wheat and the commodity crops, but they don't have a lot of information about small farms. So we're trying to help bridge that gap by getting this benchmarking data, submitting it anonymously to USDA, and figuring out what makes a small farm profitable. How can you become profitable as a small farm? Is there a size? Is there a um, a number of years that it takes? These are all questions that we have that we're trying to answer. So if you're interested, feel free to drop your email in the chat or email me at emily.brown@tufts.edu. And thank you to our funders, Northeast Extension Risk Management Education. Without them, we would not have a free workshop tonight. And just to give you guys a little lay of the land, we've got Jonathan Ebba from UNH. He's going to speak for about an hour or so. And then we have Mark and Joss from Series Greenhouse Solutions, and they're going to talk about some climate batteries and other fun technological things. And around 6 p.m., I'm going to try to remember to give us a little bio break since we'll have been sitting for a long time. And if I forget, please just remind me in the chat, and I will interrupt us and give us 5 minutes so that we can stand up and stop staring at the screen for a few minutes. All right. So just to share the poll results, looks like we have a good range of people here today. We've got a lot of new people, a lot of people kind of in this middle area between beginner and advanced, and nobody thinks they're an expert tonight, which is, I mean, we're always all learning. So thank you all for being so humble, I guess. Cool. So that's it for my slides. So I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan from UNH.
Great. Thanks. I think you're seeing my title slide there and not my notes. Thanks so much for having me. Looking at the chat, there's a lot more Southerners here than I thought were going to be. I'm up in New Hampshire. Woke up to 3 degrees Fahrenheit this morning. So I don't do a lot in this talk on evaporative cooling and some of the challenges that y'all might have down in, I saw Mississippi and Georgia and North Carolina and whatnot. But we'll sort of do some application stuff afterwards, where I'm hoping at the end people can take what we just talked about and apply that to create some solutions for their production. So maybe during that time we can explore a little bit some of the more aggressive cooling options that are used down south. I'm with University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension. I consult with growers. On our team, my expertise really is in the structures themselves of greenhouses and high tunnels, and then soilless production. So I worked for 18 years in the ornamentals industry as an ornamentals grower before coming to the university and teaching for a while before moving to extension. And and so I understand a lot of the folks I'm talking to tonight are organic growers. I tend to not work with soil as much, but definitely with the structures. So whenever one of our consultants is working with an organic grower and that person has issues with climate management or whatnot, I'll get called in for that. So with that understanding, I'll just give a quick overview here. And again, this is New Hampshire standards. When we talk about a tunnel, the idea is that, and I say this, and I realize I've got North Carolinians here, but I'll typically say it's like farming in North Carolina in New Hampshire, right? So this is an unheated tunnel. And the idea is that we can get some of our warm season crops in earlier. At the end of our season, often we'll get a frost, which would kill crops that were warm season crops, which were outside, and the high tunnel can protect that and give us a couple extra weeks of production. And then, of course, if we grow in September and October, then when Halloween comes for us up here and we just don't have enough sunlight anymore to put on growth, these high tunnels, unheated high tunnels, can be used to, with the use of frost blankets, have winter greens production to sell fresh greens. So even though the greens aren't putting on a lot of growth, they can be maintained in those high tunnels, of course. So what happens in an unheated tunnel when it's 90 degrees outside? Um, we'll talk about ventilation a little bit later, but obviously it heats right up. And what happens when it's 10 degrees outside? Obviously it cools right down. I'm going to use Fahrenheit, inches, feet, etc. in this talk. So that has clear repercussions for frost sensitive plants, right? If we wanted to grow, if we had the light availability and wanted to grow tomatoes in November in New Hampshire, likely we couldn't. We just don't have that heat in the tunnel. And I realize, looking at the graph, most of you already know this, but sometimes some new growers aren't clear what the difference between a heated and an unheated space is. And by contrast, when I say a greenhouse, typically we think of this as like farming in the tropics, right? So by manipulating, obviously, heat and potentially light as well, we can produce crops at even in the wintertime up here, right? So think through what level of control we'd be needing in a greenhouse, right? We need to mitigate, just like in the high tunnel, we need to mitigate heat spikes. We need to be able to maintain temperature through the winter through the use of fuel or other heating devices. And of course, we're thinking about putting in a clean breaks on these crops so that we can get sanitized and break the pest and disease cycle. But the nice thing about if we're manipulating our system is that we can time those breaks based on market demands rather than based on just on the environment. So maybe we do clean break at the end of the summer when our prices are lower. The first system I want to talk about is airflow, and I'm curious to see if the folks from Sears greenhouses later on are starting to use a different type of airflow. Airflows that we've used in the past and kind of got away from in greenhouses are coming back again now. But before I even talk about heat, I want to talk about the importance of moving air around the greenhouse. And the way that we have landed on doing this for now is to create a circulation, create a current that rotates through the house. And the purpose of this airflow, this is not cooling, right? Occasionally we'll get new growers who say it's so hot, but I've got 4 fans in there, right? We can't cool just by moving the inside air around. What moving that inside air around is doing is it's creating an even distribution of the heat. And really importantly, at that leaf, when the leaf surface is transpiring, it's got this little tiny pocket where it's almost 100% humidity. And that humidity makes it really difficult for the plant to do more transpiration. And so it's stripping away that humidity pocket that allows the plants to continue to uptake nutrients. And it also helps to limit the fungal spores and the disease that wants to germinate on that leaf surface at that high humidity. Right, so we want to make sure we're moving our air around the greenhouse. The simplest way we've come up to do this is these horizontal airflow fans. In the old days, there used to be vertical fans that would push down, or tubes that we would blow through that would circulate up. We're starting to see some of those coming back again, but this was determined at one point to be the most effective way of doing this, particularly with benched crops. If we are heating that greenhouse, we want to be thinking obviously in terms of having that current take that heat from the heater and work with it rather than blowing back at it. I want us to be thinking about the way air moves. When we get into ventilation, we can think if we have big fans at the back of the house and we're creating a negative pressure that's, pulling out that hot air and returning it with cooler outside air, think of how that air is moving. And we're going to talk about some snags that we get into with ventilation there. If instead we have our sides up, and as the air moves outside, the air moves out there. Think about the conflict that would exist between this horizontal airflow and some of the different ventilation things. So ideally, we're not running horizontal airflow when we're trying to move that air in a different direction during ventilation. The classic way to do this would be to have these fans on a relay such that when the furnace is running, these fans run. When the furnace is not running, these fans run. And then when ventilation is occurring, these fans would cease running to not have those competing airflows.
Is there an ideal shape for a fan? I know I feel like I've used a box fan in a pinch that I've like kind of jerry rigged up to the greenhouse, and I know it's not ideal, but is there like an ideal kind of fan?
Yeah, for sure. Yep. So if we think about the volume of that greenhouse, often we'll just go on a freestanding hoop house. We'll just plan that volume up to about 8 feet, right? So if you have a 30 by 96, or say 30 by 100 to 8 feet, length times width times height, that gives us like 23,000 cubic feet in that house, right? And so the rule of thumb is that we want to move 1/4 of that per minute. So in that example, if we have a 23,000 cubic feet of air, we want 1/4 of that per minute, we want to move 6,000 cubic feet per minute, right? So if we had a setup like this with the 4 fans, 6,000 cubic feet per minute, we'd want each of these to be moving about 1,500 cubic feet per minute. And then we can come in with a little device that measures our airspeed and make sure that in addition to the correct volume moving around that house, that we also have a speed between 70 and 200 feet per minute. So yeah, I've used plenty of box fans in the past too. They don't last as long, right? They burn out really quick in the greenhouse. And certainly the purpose-built HAFs, they come in at just a couple different diameters, will last longer, obviously.
Thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts or input on horizontal airflow? Anybody using different systems, turbulators or perforated bags?
What is a turbulator or a perforated bag?
Yeah, so the turbulator would be the kind of old school, like a ceiling fan, where the air is blowing down and coming up and around. I think one of the reasons we're starting to see return of those is the horizontal airflow really kind of came was really well suited for like bench culture. And when we start to pack tunnels with vines, I think a lot of folks are seeing that they need more fans than they thought they did to get good circulation throughout. And so the vertical. Another one would be where we've got the small tubes that run along, and this is more in the hydroponics than in high tunnels, but we've got the tubes that run along the bottom that are inflated, and those are actually turbulating, jumbling up the air coming out of that. But the idea is that by moving the air around, we're um, eliminating hot spots and eliminating gradients in the humidity, particularly at the leaf surface.
Cool. There's one person in the chat who said that they had solar powered extraction fans in the past.
So like to pull that air out of the house. If you're pulling that air out of the house, yeah. So that'll I would we're going to call that ventilation rather than airflow, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. That's cool though. Yeah, that's great. So we're seeing up here more and more heated high tunnels. So in-ground, still in-ground production, but with some supplemental heat from fossil fuels. We are seeing some with wood as well, but propane or oil are the simplest typically.
I have a one quick
Mhm.
question before
Yeah.
we go to heat. Is there an optimal fan height above the ground?
So unfortunately, it's often limited by humans, in terms of walking and not being hit. But we want to get it fairly close actually to the crop. And in fact, ideally, if we're using this, we would be taking that wind speed at the crop. Um, and so, in the real world, a lot of folks have variability in terms of how they pitch their fans because you can't buy a fan that's exactly the speed or the volume that you need. And so they'll pitch their fans or adjust the height accordingly.
Awesome,
But
thank you.
another rule of thumb is, we just see a slight flutter, uh, but not not whipping or trembling at the leaf.
Great, thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm not sure how far to go into heat. If you have an old furnace like this, until recently, in New Hampshire anyway, NRCS was funding the replacement of these with newer, higher efficiency furnaces. Certainly worth taking a look if you've got some of these old ones kicking around. I saw that you had my colleague Jesse give a presentation earlier in the month or earlier in the year. If you're choosing to heat, remember all these things are just tools, right? So I mean, if you think, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a warmer greenhouse? Really the way to think is where's my market and what crop am I going to produce, and then to create an enterprise budget around that, right? I can help you, or your extension agent can help you. Um, we can estimate fuel consumption. Um, based on your location and what you want to grow and the temperature you want to grow it at. So we can run those calcs for you. But if you're thinking about moving toward heat, we need to consider not just the fuel, but also the additional electricity and really make sure that you have the market, that this is a tool you need for the crop that you have a market for, rather than just thinking about it would be great if I could be warmer. Um, Size also, matters depending on what temperature you want to maintain and the specifications on your house. Again, your extension agents should be able to help you size the furnace and tell you how big you need. Those are in BTUs per hour, and we can tell you how many BTUs per hour you need to achieve your goals. It's actually all I have on heat. I know the folks from Sears are going to talk about some other interesting ways of getting some heat in there. Any questions on this?
Uh, I forget, Jonathan, from your slides, are you going to be touching on geothermal heat at all?
No. Nope. I'm
Okay,
leaving that for the the
series.
experts. Yeah.
Yes. Um, and uh, will you be talking at all about compost options?
For compost heat? No, nope. Is someone doing that?
There was a question about it in the chat. I don't know if anyone's
We
doing it.
we
Um,
can we can chime in on that as well. There are people doing it, and we can definitely talk about that.
okay, cool.
We had just
So
one project I worked with once, and he farmer built a great. It was cut short by fire actually, but built it an interesting system.
mhm.
And I'm assuming the folks from Sears will talk about too. Like a lot of this depends on how much control you need and how much precision in your climate control you need. And if you're doing a crop that you're willing to have some, greater window on crop timing and whatnot, then there are more options. If you're growing liners for liner sale and you need to get a 6.5 week crop, then you need to have the tools that are going to be able to keep you locked into that production time. And certainly heat is one of those.
Thank you.
I see a
And there's
hand from,
yes,
oh,
we have
good.
a hand raising. So Stephanie, you can come off mute if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, hi. I'm just getting some education here because I don't have any power at all in my tunnel, so not even fans. And I'm wondering what the impact on my circulation would be because I use drip irrigation, drip tape, and I've definitely seen some like green growth on the soil at times when the house is like closed up for a long time for cold protection. And I'm wondering, what effect on my circulation that might be and what people with no power at all do to mitigate that.
Yeah, that's I have some interesting slides on humidity in a little bit. Unfortunately, a lot of the answers for humidity do involve power though as well. Um, and and airflow without being able to push it around in there, really kind of means that we've got to be having some mixing with the outside air, right? We haven't talked about ventilation yet, or this ventilation and heating for the sake of humidity management. But I do think that's going to be a challenge for you with stale air. I think that crusting on your soil and biofilm growing or algae growing on the soil might have some solutions other than just airflow. And I think the drip is a good way to go to limit the amount of humidity in the air. But the plants are breathing off water, right? Plants put out so much water, and and that is by definition humidity. So what are you doing, Stephanie, for ventilation?
Really just open in the I have two different setups. One has like curtains and one has a roll up doors on both ends and then the sides come up and down. But once the sides go down in late fall, they really don't start coming back up again until we see consistent days. So I've been keeping them pretty tight closed for the wintertime and just opening them up during the daytime to let air come in. But
Yeah.
I never knew about fans, and I'm wondering if that's like something NRCS would an improvement that they might support if I did want to put some power in those tunnels.
I I know the folks I've talked to up here are, again, until recently were working on HAF fans, but you got to have the power, you got to have the electricity for them. I wonder if NRCS would work with you on alternative electrical.
Yeah, like solar would be cool. I have power in the tractor barn and it's probably like a 20-30 foot distance away, so I would have to like run extension cords or something like that to get power in there. So I heard somebody mention box fans. That would be my only option right now, I think.
I can only speak about this for New Hampshire, but one of the challenges our growers have too is, depending on how attentive the town is, in New Hampshire, a high tunnel is not a taxable structure until it has underground utilities or other things. And so we see some of that extension cord solution just to keep the house as what we call a demountable structure and exempt from property tax. But
Yeah, and I think in Massachusetts, it's a cement pad. As long as you don't have a cement pad under your tunnels or greenhouses, they're not considered a structure. Um, but again, depends on the state you're in.
But I'll talk just quickly about coverings. I just had this chart up here. So we do calculations using U, which is like the transference of heat. It's kind of the opposite of R. So we think about an R value, which is how well the heat, the substance stops the heat moving. U is how well the substance moves the heat. So for example, something really, something that prevents the heat from moving through it very quickly is going to have this low U, whereas just a single layer polyethylene is going to have a high U value. And I just wanted to show, because folks think a lot about the twin wall polycarbonate, and the U value between the twin wall polycarbonate and double inflated poly isn't that great. Not a huge difference there. And if you're heating your greenhouse, having some sort of an insulation, whether double inflated poly or the twin wall polycarbonate, is really important. Obviously, it's super critical. There's some debate about double layer poly on an unheated house. I personally, even way up here, am not a fan. I'm not sure really what we're insulating when we put double inflated poly on an unheated house. And we're so desperate for sunlight in the winter months that those two layers reduce the amount of photons getting through. So double inflated if you're heating. My vote is single layer if you're not heating, but some people do like to double it up if they're not heating. They feel it keeps it tighter and protects against some of the winter winds. If you are inflating, a lot of folks inflate using the inside air, but you can see here that, so there's a little blower in here, and this blower is taking air from the outside and putting it down and filling up between those two layers of poly. We hear a lot of folks asking, questions about really creative ways of saving energy, and they want, we're going to hear about a GAHT system. It's one that we get a lot of folks requesting, what would it take to retrofit my high tunnel with a GAHT system or some sort of climate battery. And you go and see the greenhouse, and there's gaps in their poly, and air is just leaking out all over the place. And there's a lot of low hanging fruit just in maintenance, and particularly when we're dealing with our poly inflation, holes, patching, etc. Think about our sidewalls when we're using roll-up sides. A lot of folks don't inflate those in the winter time. And Stephanie was saying that she pretty much doesn't use her sidewalls in the winter. I'll have a slide coming up about roll-up sides and winter care of them. But think about what might we do to inflate those sidewalls. And I'll talk about that in a minute, because that's a large surface area that, when it's just a single layer of poly, has a significant heat loss. So ventilation, when we think of catastrophes in our tunnels, excess heat can be a really catastrophic event, and it can happen pretty quickly. A lot of folks start off thinking that they don't need, automation in their ventilation. They'll just come up and roll up the T-handle in the morning and bring it back down in the evening. And it only takes, a couple hours on a really sunny day to do damage in a plant. So ventilation is a plan that we need to have. On roll-up sides, I suspect most folks have these on their tunnels. They're easy to install. We construct, actually, this greenhouse here, you can see we didn't put in the second. This was on a slope, and so this gap shouldn't exist here. This ends up being closed off. But we constructed this entire greenhouse, and we had a video series on how to construct a greenhouse from bare ground to roll-up sides. And if you're interested in that, you can find it on Google. These ropes here, of course, are anti-billow ropes to prevent the wind from banging that bar. Most folks have seen this. The one thing I want to talk about is in ventilation. Traditionally, with ventilation, say if we were doing both roof and sides, which I'm not advocating here, we're rule of thumbing 40% of the floor area being open space, right? So if we were on a 30 by 96, that's 6 feet high per side. A lot of folks with older tunnels don't have that much opening. And the reason I mention that is we're hearing more and more about insect screening now too, and people wanting to insect screen their roll-up sides. We need to be aware of the fact that when you put a screen or a mesh or anything across that opening, we're creating a drastic reduction in the air's capacity to get through there, just how much space is open, and then also, of course, creating turbulence on that air as it leaves. So if you are thinking about screening, keep in mind the percentage of open space in that screen, and apply that percentage to the overall percentage, and get a sense of how much ventilation you're going to lose when you put up a screen. And of course, that depends on the mesh. In the greenhouses years ago, we used to use thrips screening, and that has really kind of fallen out of vogue. To keep thrips out, those holes are so tiny. But I hear folks now, and I see folks now with high tunnels saying, I just want to screen out cucumber beetles, right? So maybe they don't need as much screening. So I'm not advocating for insect screens. I'm not arguing against them either. I'm saying understand the profound impact they have on the open area for ventilation. This is just one quick aside. Rolling this way, and I'll talk in just on the next screen about winterization and ways that we can prevent air coming in. But if we're looking at the roll-up side here, when we roll them up like this, it's the way a lot of folks start doing it. And then, of course, the water fills in here, and we get algal growth in here, and that weight of that water can kind of pull on it and cause a slip on that poly eventually, and it stops going up evenly. We get water shedding when we roll these the other way. If we have our roll-up side set like this, Emily, did you?
I was just going to make a comment about how I've done the roll-up sides where the water goes into it and then it rusts out the pipe, and then you are rolling up the most annoying, terrible thing. So please, if you get a new high tunnel, roll it the way that the water does not go in. You will thank yourself later, and you will not have to be outside in freezing cold weather trying to get ice out from in between layers of plastic.
Or even just having all that green water like run back at you, right? So here's an interesting thing on this between the first and second bow, we put a permanent layer of woven poly. So this kind of creates a baffle so that in the colder weather, the air has a harder time infiltrating the greenhouse at the roll-up side. And when the time comes when you're not using this side anymore, right? Like right now up here, nobody's using their roll-up sides unless they've been really diligent about shoveling out a pathway, because they're iced up on the edges and whatnot. You should shovel out the sides of your greenhouses from the snow. But folks who haven't, we're not in roll-up side weather right now in New Hampshire. And so one of the things we can actually do there is if you use this wire lock channel, we can actually continue that down underneath the roll-up side and attach a layer to the baseboard as well, so that when this goes down for the winter, we can actually secure it here and here. And then by pulling out one piece of the wire lock attachment up here, if you have a double inflated poly, that'll actually allow inflation on the sidewall as well. There's a lot of surface area here on a heated house that in the wintertime, when it's a single layer, wastes a bit of fuel. So it's nice if we can inflate this. There are jumper hoses if that technique doesn't work for you as well. But we can secure this down for the winter time.
There is a question in the chat if it's possible to reverse the way that they're rolled, and there is one quick answer that says to just keep unrolling until it starts rolling the other way. Is there any other thing to do to help that? I know there's like the clips that are on there. Should you like change the positioning of the clips or anything, or just keep unrolling until it rolls the other way?
Yeah, just keep, if you have a gearbox on the guide pipe, you might have to bring it all the way down, and you might run out of guide pipe, but even then it usually just kind of billows out. Just keep rolling. I agree with the answer.
Thank you.
So if we have roll-up sides and we're using active ventilation to cool just in the winter time, we can target just 1/4 of an air exchange per minute. So So just like with our HAF fans, figure out the volume of the house to 8 feet, and we can blow air out. And anytime we are actively pushing air out of the house, we need to have a place where the air can come back in, right? And this intake area needs to be just a little bit larger than the output area. And so the reason I mention that is because a lot of folks think in terms of active ventilation, where we need a lot more fan speed to get one air exchange per minute in the summertime. And folks with roll-up sides often get a little daunted, not realizing we can simply put these peak mounted exhaust fans and intake louvers to achieve winter cooling based on a thermostat. And again, sorry, Stephanie, this is all electricity.
Jonathan, could I add a quick comment about these higher fans that you're showing?
Please.
You mentioned smart controls earlier with something as simple as that high exhaust fan and a humidistat or a smart controller. This can also work as a very gentle exhaust, which works as a dehumidifier depending on what's happening outside in the winter. So we'll often, using a heater, maybe be heating, but also when we need to dehumidify, we'll just run these fans for a little while to get in some outside cooler air with less
Excellent.
humidity in it. Yeah.
Thanks. Yep, I have a couple slides on humidity here in a minute. And I'm looking at my clock and realizing I should probably pick this up a little bit. It kind of stands to reason if we're pushing that air out, it has to come in from somewhere. And so we need to have intake louvers on the other side. Often we'll see folks trying to push air out of a greenhouse with the roll-up sides up, or worse, with this door open, right? And so when that happens, the air's lazy and it wants to take the shortest route. And so we tend to not get the pressure that we need to pull all that air out of the house if this door is open or if the roll-up sides are open, right? And that air kind of short circuits it. So we want to make sure that we're using the intake louver on the opposite wall. You can open the door on the opposite wall, opposite of the fan, but make sure that the door on the fan side isn't opened. Another option we have on cooling up here is shade. This is a little bit of a silly photo. That's, obviously providing some shade to the house, but our shade cloths are usually larger than that. We're seeing more and more white shade cloth, which is great. What's the problem with shade cloth for things like tomatoes and cucumbers? Problem is it shades, right? We're using it for temperature control and to prevent, scalds on some things. But if it's up too early or too late, again, here in the northern latitudes, our light can be limiting. The nice thing in the middle of the summer, we have really long days, but early on, not so much. And so we do need to think about the total amount of light that's reaching the plant. I think I have time. We'll talk about DLI. We'll talk about light in a minute. And there are options for ridge vents on poly houses. They make some people nervous. NRCS, again, here was paying to retrofit poly houses with ridge vents. I do love ridge vent with side vent, but they do have maintenance requirements.
I've got a question from the chat, Jonathan. And if we go over a little bit, the last half hour is kind of set aside for Q&A. But since we are doing some Q&A in the talk right now, I'm totally fine if you go over by a few minutes. So don't worry about rushing too much. The question in the chat is there a recommended high temperature you want to stay under on warmer days? And I guess that would be for like hot season crops such as like tomatoes, cucumbers, things like that.
Yeah. Yes, certainly. So our different crops are going to have different ideal targets and then sort of thresholds above and below that. And it depends on how you're cooling as well, in terms of how much you're able to cool that house, but also if you're able to stage it, right? And so maybe on a tomato, we might set, a set point during the daytime when the sun's up at like 76. And then if we go up to say 80 beyond that, maybe our next level of cooling kicks in. And so we can think about staging that appropriately. But yes, yeah. So we have one, we want to be thinking about sort of that ideal average daily temperature and how we achieve that average daily temperature ideal. And then obviously what are action thresholds above and below that to make something happen in the environment.
Thank you. And another quick question. This is actually my question. I worked at a farm for a while where we, on the high tunnels in the greenhouses, like it would start getting cooler in the day. So we're trying to keep the greenhouses warmer. So at like maybe 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we're like, all right, close everything down. Don't open those doors anymore. Is that actually helpful for heating up the greenhouse floor to keep it warmer overnight? Or is that just kind of trying to do something that's futile because you're in a giant plastic bubble?
Hmm. I certainly I wouldn't call it futile. No. I think, the idea that you're using the thermal mass, and again, the series folks are going to talk more about this, I assume, but you're using the thermal mass that's already existent there to maintain that solar radiation and give some back at night in terms of heat. Yeah. Unfortunately, a sunset is one of those critical times for humidity control, and again, we'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, you want to, we have that sun out there, and it's unfortunate that in most of these systems we are dumping the sun heat during the day and then at night burning a fossil fuel to get more heat. And again, this is going to be where series talks about, but what we can do to conserve that solar heat that's coming into that greenhouse, instead of just blowing it out the air, can we put that into something that will then return that to us later on?
Great. Another quick question from the chat. So the white cloth versus the black shade cloth, is it mostly the difference in how much light it's blocking out, or like light transmission? What's the big difference between the two? And are there other color options?
So there are other color options that do some different, like, experimental things for different crops. The amount of shade we get is really going to be a function of the weave, and so the shade cloth will be labeled as a certain percentage of the shade. But the white is more reflective in terms of the cloth not absorbing the heat from the sun itself, or not turning the light into heat.
Great, thank you.
Sure. And I just wanted to point out here too, we are seeing more and more in high tunnels 24-volt stuff. So this might be intriguing to Stephanie, or I'm sorry, we're DC. We're seeing more direct current stuff, where either roll-up sides, automatic roll-up sides are working on direct current, or louver actuators working on direct current. So this can be done with solar and battery as well. I won't park too much in light. It's just as I was preparing this, I was kind of thinking through the different systems that we need to worry about. I suspect most folks here aren't adding light to their crops. Maybe I'm wrong, but we think about our crops as needing a certain amount of light per day, right? And so we measure the photons that hit a square meter per second, or we can measure them across the course of the day. And sorry, I can kind of geek out on light, and I want to make sure I don't go into it more than I have to here. I don't want to get boring on it. But so, for example, we need 15 moles of photons per square meter per day. So a mole is just a number like a dozen. Like, imagine you dumped out a dozen ping pong balls, right? We can think of what that looks like, right? And so a mole is also a number, but it's got like 23 zeros on it. So you dump out a mole of if you have a bucket, and you dump out a mole of ping pong balls, it'll cover the Earth twice the depth of Mount Everest. So it's a really, really big number. And we can count the little packets of light coming that way. And so you need 15 moles of photons per square meter per day, for lettuce, give or take. Like at the solstice here in New Hampshire, the sun gives us 8 moles per day. So just in terms of producing lettuce during those low light times, we would need to supplement light. And Purdue has great, so that amount per day we call the daily light integral, or the DLI. And Purdue has these great DLI maps out now where you can see month by month how many moles per day your area of the nation, of the country, is getting. And I have like an online worksheet that can help you look at how much light am I actually getting to my crop, and then how long do I have to run my lamps to hit a target. But we do need to be thinking about light. And like we said at the beginning, for us, that's the main reason we grow our winter greens. The growing happens in September and October, and they just kind of chill out in the house after that because of the low temps, obviously, but also because of the low light. CO2, I won't talk about adding this. It's just something to think about, right? We know that in the wintertime, if you have a greenhouse that's full of plants and all closed up, they can pull all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere from like 400 parts per million down to 200 parts per million. And at 200 parts per million, photosynthesis kind of stops, right? Like we think about climate change, and we think about how much carbon is in the atmosphere, and we're worried that 400 is like a tipping point. Photosynthesis evolved at 1200 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the plants are like, keep it coming. Folks who are doing sort of more high tech on the hydroponic side will be supplementing carbon dioxide, and they'll actually go up 1,000 or more parts per million carbon dioxide. So I think more for us, rather than thinking about supplementing carbon dioxide, it's just being aware of the fact that plants are pulling all the carbon out of the air. That's what they do. That's photosynthesis. And when they bring it from 400 parts down to 200 parts, they stop doing photosynthesis, right? And so we need to occasionally think about making that air up. And carbon is a part of our system management that we often don't think about. So on Josh, you had mentioned your control systems that are taking into making decisions based on humidity and temperature. Are you going to talk about integrated controls in your presentation?
You pulled this slide up, and I just started adding a photo to a new slide. So yes, we are going to talk about it quickly.
Okay, then I will. I'll move on.
Wow,
I'll
but
move on from here.
ours is a little bit different. So you might want to just at least give a once over of what you're showing. Ours are like very modern and high tech, and so it's nice to see the options.
Sure. Yep. So this one on the left is called a thermostat. It's a switch. And what happens is, depending on whether you're using it for heating or cooling, as the temperature moves in one direction or the other, it'll close that switch, and it allows the fan to run, or it allows the heater to come on. And so when we start having 2 exhaust fans and a winter cooling fan and automated roll-up sides and a furnace in a house, we start to have a lot of thermostats who are all kind of making their own decisions and not talking to one another. There are some great advancements now in more integrated control, and I'll let Josh talk about some of that, but they don't all have to be daunting. There's integrated control that's really within reach for small, mid-size farmers doing stuff in high tunnels. And so the nice thing about integrated control is that one, it might be integrated with your alarm system as well to let you know when something's going wrong in the house in terms of temperature. We can have a single input that is staging our different responses to that input. And then as we get a little more fancy, we can start to make decisions based upon not just the temperature set point, but humidity, or we can calculate the effect that humidity is having in terms of the vapor pressure differential, things like that. So think about our control. A lot of folks start off with thermostats, right? If you have thermostats mounted in your house, you want to make sure that They're shielded from the direct sun, usually, so we'll put them like on the north side of some sort of a board. Don't put them on the end walls, put them in the middle of the house on the north side of some sort of a board. Even better is to build a house that has a little fan that we're blowing air through it. But we want to think about making sure that these thermostats are knowing the air temperature and that they're not being tricked by the sun or by being on the outside wall or something. All right, so what is humidity, right? So humidity is the the amount of water that's dissolved in the air. So we can imagine dissolving salt in water. Water actually also dissolves in air. And just like when we're dissolving salt in water, the hotter you make that water, the more salt you can put in there, the more salt you can fit in there. And likewise, the hotter you make that air, the more water you can fit into the air, right? And so relative humidity is saying, based on how much water this air could hold at this temperature, how much is in there. So what happens, what are some of the problems that we get from high humidity? Why is high humidity a challenge? This picture here is an interesting response called guttation. A plant is moving water through its xylem by evaporating it out those stomata. And in order to do that, it's 100% humidity inside the leaf. And if it's 10% humidity outside, that huge difference makes it really, really easy for that water to leave the leaf. If it's 95 out here and 100 in here, it's much more difficult for that water to leave that leaf. And so some plants, not all, have evolved this response to be able to like keep the water flowing even under really high conditions. When you get your feet soaked walking on the lawn in the morning and people say, oh, the dew is on the grass, dew's real and there probably is some dew on the grass, but really what you're getting soaked on is guttation. It came through the plant rather than just falling out of the sky. So in high humidity, of course, also really favorable for a lot of our fungal diseases. Obviously, fungal diseases germinate at high humidities. Low humidity can result in excessive drying, right? Excessive water requirements. Two-spotted mites love low humidity. And where does it come from in a greenhouse? It comes from the plants largely, right? It comes some from our irrigation and some from the air, but these plants are just barfing out water and it's going into the air. So if we look at this here, so this yellow circle is, remember I said the hotter the air is, the more water it can hold. So this yellow circle, we can represent like the amount of water that could be held by the air, right? And then we can imagine 20 pounds of water, right? 20 pounds of water, that's a reasonable amount of water that would be in the air in a 30 by 96 greenhouse. So, there might be a ton of air, dry air might weigh a ton in the greenhouse, and we would have 20 pounds of water in there. So at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, that water can hold a lot of, I'm sorry, the air can hold a lot of water. Now imagine we have that same amount of water in there. And then as the sun starts to go down, our temperature starts to fall in that house. And now that house is only 70 degrees. We have the same amount of water, but the air can only hold this much water, right? And so this would mean our relative humidity is going up, even though the amount of water in the air is remaining constant. And then we can imagine here at 60 degrees, much, much smaller. So what's going to happen at 55 degrees in this scenario? This water is going to have more, I'm sorry, I keep saying that. This air is going to have more water than it can hold. And some of that water is going to come out, and that's going to look like fog. That's going to be condensation. And that's results in free water on leaf surfaces, which is really great if you are powdery mildew or leaf mold rather, but really, not good for our plants. I'll come back to this concept here in a second. We talk about some mitigation things. Condensation is a concern, not just for disease, but obviously it obscures the light. On our films, we should have an anti-condensate coating, which is going to allow that condensation to sheet instead of making all these light reflecting bubbles and droplets. We want to make sure that We are irrigating on a rising temperature, right? So in the greenhouse industry, we always water first thing in the morning, right? We avoid watering in the evening when the temperature is going down, because on that past slide where we had here's the 20 pounds, we don't want to add more to that as that water is going down. This is why we always irrigate on rising temp. And if we do need to manage humidity, and Josh gave us a little sneak peek at this. So here's that greenhouse that's really humid because it's at 6. So this is at sunset at 60 degrees, and it's got all that water in there from the day. If we ventilate that and push all that wet air out and bring in the dry outside air, maybe that dry outside air is even colder, right? Maybe it's 50. So you can see this yellow circle smaller than this one. It can hold less moisture than this air could, but it's been outside. It hasn't had the plants breathing in it, and there's less moisture in it. Now, while we're doing that, or immediately following that, if we heat it up and we bring that back up to 70, we see we still have the same amount of water in there, but the capacity to hold that air, I'm sorry, the air's capacity to hold the water is greatly increased. And so we have this lower relative humidity. So one of the ways that we can manage relative humidity is to bring in cold, dry air, get rid of our wet air, and then heat it up. And I think Josh is going to tell us about some automatic ways that he can do that. All right, so just kind of think through with me here. If we're overheating, right? Our plants are heat stressed. Maybe we see sun scald, etc. What are some options we have if we're overheating? How are you going to think about this in your production? How do you address this?
Got one person in the chat saying ventilation, shade cloth.
Great. Anybody out there, any of our Southerners doing any evaporative cooling? So when would you be thinking about shade cloth? And Emily, is my typing coming up on the
Yeah, I'm
screen
seeing
for
your
you?
typing.
Okay, great.
When the peppers and tomatoes start to scald.
Yeah. So scald, yep. I would say we probably want to get that on before that scalding happens. Yep. Yep. When is that for you? I don't remember where you're at, Stephanie. What month is that for you?
Can start as early as June, mid to late June. I'm in Decatur, Georgia. We have all the stuff you're talking about, 100% humidity, stuff scalding and burning. Like I leave the tunnels open at night a lot of the times because even the evenings are pretty warm and it can get super, super hot. And like even the regular air outside can feel close to 100% humidity. So the tunnels can be like dripping on the insides.
Yeah. Want to get that out of there, right? Although to the
And then
opposite of that, so when we're thinking about and actually I have one on this for the tomato, when we're thinking about maybe during the heat of the day when the sun's really up high overhead, I asked if anybody down south is doing evaporative cooling, and I won't talk about the high-tech systems that do that or the systems that do this, but we do have some low-tech evaporative cooling, right? Does anybody use any low-tech evaporative cooling? In the old days, they used to call it syringing the plants.
I don't know if this counts as evaporative cooling, but one person is saying that they had a mister that they would combine with the main fan and
Exactly.
intake louver to reduce heat and humidity very quickly.
Yeah, fantastic. Yep, that's definitely evaporative cooling. Yeah. So as that liquid water becomes vapor, it needs a lot of heat to undergo that phase change. And so it's taking in heat from the greenhouse through that evaporative process. Yep, absolutely. So that's really cool. So yeah, so that could be done with misting. Could be done with evaporative pads, which is just a piece of equipment. And the old school is syringing, right? So we've been talking about managing humidity, and now we're just making it worse during the the full sun. But if we're doing this during the heat of the day, folks used to spray their plants down, right? You spray the plants down with water or spray the floors down with water. And so the idea is that as that water undergoes the phase change and becomes a gas, it's taking in a lot of heat with it.
Brings me back to my college days when we didn't have air conditioning. So me and my friends would sit in front of a fan with a little spray mister bottle.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. So those I think somebody here I saw was from the desert, right? Is someone here from Arizona? So you desert folks, when you sweat, that liquid evaporates and it takes heat away from your body. Unfortunately, us northerners during the summertime, when we sweat, it's already 90% humidity out there, and the sweat doesn't evaporate. It just runs down us and makes us gross and wet. But if it evaporated, it would do its job and cool us off. Here's an important one. So calcium deficiency, right? So this is calcium deficiency on lettuce. What's classic calcium deficiency on a tomato? What do we call that during ripening?
We've got Blossom end rot in the chat from multiple
Yeah.
people.
That's it.
We're
Perfect.
very
Yeah.
familiar with this.
Yep, that's it. So, but we know that a lot of times calcium deficiency isn't because we don't have enough calcium deficiency. I mean, we don't have enough calcium, right? Obviously, if we don't have enough calcium, that's the first thing. So ensure sufficient calcium. But what else do we know about calcium? So calcium moves through the xylem. And in order for calcium to get to the sinks, whether that's the growing point of the lettuce or the growing point of anything, or the fruit in peppers and tomatoes, that water has to be flowing through the plant. And what do we know? What prevents water from flowing through a plant, or what slows down water from flowing through a plant? One, if you don't have any water, right? But two, if we have that high humidity at the leaf surface, right? So by increasing transpiration, we can help to reduce calcium deficiency. So based on what we talked about, what are we gonna do to increase transpiration?
I see somebody saying HAF.
Yes. Yep. So increase HAF. Hang a box fan on it, right? What else can we do to increase transpiration? Kind of the old classic one that people used to say is we want consistent watering. And then of course, so increasing HAF is going to strip the humidity off the leaf and mix it in the house. But at some point, like Stephanie, even if you are mixing that air really nicely in the house, at some point the humidity in the house gets so high and the plant can't transpire. So we need to reduce our humidity. Any other thoughts on calcium deficiency in terms of environmentally? There are sprays we can use. We can apply remedy calcium through a spray, but these are the environmental ones.
Somebody's mentioning the pH being too far off also.
If the pH is too far off, the plants have a hard time bringing up the calcium.
Yeah. So before you go into your next slide, I asked in the chat if anyone wants a bio break or if you'd like to keep going. I didn't see anyone who was looking for a bio break, but if you do, just like you can raise your hand and we could take a quick break right now, or looks like there's just one or two more slides that you have, Jonathan. We could finish up your slides and take a quick 5-minute break for people to get up and stretch their legs.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah. So this will be my last one, and then I'll stop talking. Does that work for you?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool. All right. So we want to think in terms of like kind of building a plan, right? If we're growing tomato, what are you thinking about in your plan in terms of airflow, and then maybe even throughout the season? So we want HAF probably consistent throughout the season. Maybe we get it so it's not running when we're ventilating. This is another nice thing about an integrated controller is we can make it so the HAF stops running when we ventilate. Okay. What about heat? This is going to vary. We got people from all over the country here, right? But there are plenty of folks growing tomatoes in the summer up here in New Hampshire without any supplemental heat in their high tunnels. Obviously, they're growing transplants in a heated space. What about cooling? How are we thinking in terms of cooling on our tomato crop? Roll up sides. Maybe we have the small exhaust in peak until we can use the roll up sides. At some point, those roll up sides stay open. When would that be? When would you be thinking about these roll up sides staying open? When we're not worried about flower drop from cold nights.
We've got some people saying August, June, August in the chat.
Yeah.
I have one person mentioning bees. There
Oh,
was
yeah.
some talk in the chat earlier that about whether or not the insect netting would be keeping bees and pollinators out, and the answer from another workshop they had was yes, but you can buy bumblebee boxes. So that's a thing to think about.
Yep, for sure. We'll skip to disease. What are we, and I've actually got some cheats here. So leaf mold, did everyone have tons of leaf mold this year? We had tons of it. Some of the clients I was working with. But here's an interesting thing, right? Leaf mold requires greater than 85% humidity when we're around 70 to 75 degrees for 4 hours in order to germinate, right? So theoretically, if we could every 4 hours bring our relative humidity to below 85%, then we could break a lot of that leaf mold germination and prevent some of that serious leaf mold damage that we saw this year. Powdery mildew, it's not quite as clean on powdery mildew. Powdery mildew sort of has this just germination curve as relative humidity increases, but it prefers that temperature range, 70 to 80 degrees. And as the relative humidity increases, it gets worse. So we can actually think about limiting some of our disease pressure by manipulating our humidity, or at least breaking those 4 hour cycles of humidity. And the pests, one on the tomatoes is the two-spotted mite or spider mites, two-spotted mite. Those thrive at low relative humidity and high temperature, right? So kind of the opposite. So what if for 3.75 hours during the peak of the day when it was hottest, we fogged or we misted inside there, or we sprayed things down? And believe it or not, I know it's counter to what we've been saying, but we actually raise that relative humidity during the time when the sun is up and the mites are loving it, right? If we can do that in one of those 4 hour blocks, we can actually limit some of our pests that way. So we talk about, integrated pest management, integrated disease management, and cultural controls. What that can actually look like is learning what these diseases and pests need to thrive, and then manipulating our systems to break those. All right, that's all I got. Thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was really great. I learned some new things. We've got some hand clapping coming from the audience. Yeah, so why don't we all take a quick 5-minute bio break? We can stand up, move around a little bit, and Then we will return back at 7:19, and we'll jump in with Mark and Jonathan. Oh, sorry, not Mark and Jonathan, Mark and Josh. All right, I'll see you guys in 5 minutes.
Hey, Jonathan, this is Jerry Cavallo. Being I got you on here, is there anything you can do to keep the plastic from clouding? I'm about 6 years into it and it's super cloudy. Is there anything like Armor All or any kind of thing you can put on to clear up the plastic?
Is rigid polycarbonate or
No, it's just sheet plastic.
yeah, I hate to say it, but that's 4-year life on that. Um, so I know folks brag about how many years they can get out of it. Um, but no, and you have just one layer or two layers.
I have one with one with two, but it's really killing me, the light deprivation with the two layers.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, so sometimes during the growing season, washing the outside can be helpful. If you're inflating it, you want to make sure, be using the outside air to inflate instead of the inside
Okay.
air. But yeah, that's just like, so in the ornamentals industry where we use growth regulators, you can just see the growth regulator use increasing as you push the life of that poly.
Oh, okay.
And
I know what I gotta do this summer.
Well,
and
we're going to talk about an alternative to that, maybe, but yes, but as always, alternatives cost more money, right? Um,
So I'll look forward to
we'll,
hearing it.
we'll get to that in a minute.
All right.
Thanks.
It is 7:20. We are stretched. We are back in our seats or maybe walking around while we're listening. Sometimes I do that. And now we're going to jump in with Mark and Josh to talk about some pretty cool high-tech, high tunnel stuff.
Okay. Well, thank you, Emily. And thank you, Jonathan. That was really fun. So Josh is going to present for me. I'm in Germany right now, whatever, 1:20 in the morning. So if I'm sounding sleepy, I probably am. Wanted to talk about the GAHT system. I was asked by Emily to talk about the GAHT system before I named it the GAHT system, which is the ground to air heat transfer system, which, you know, me being a chemical engineer, that's kind of seemed like the most obvious thing that it is. So that's the name. It was formerly known also, and you can also look that up, as a climate battery. Michael Thompson and Jerome Ozentowski, which you may or may not have heard in the Aspen area, have used climate batteries before. And
Are you seeing
this,
my screen, Mark, the way you want
I
to?
have.
Or no? Yes,
I
good.
have, yeah.
Okay, great.
And we have since developed this system, and I think the biggest advances that we made is all about how do we extract the most amount of energy out of the ground to heat your greenhouse, while putting the minimum amount of energy into the system. So this optimization process is really what the GAHT system is all about and what that design is. Everybody, and I think we'll talk about that. Maybe you can show the next slide, Josh.
You know, as we're sort of being interactive in this talk, it would be interesting to know. I know climate batteries through permaculture training, and I'm just curious, like everyone who's listening, do we know what this is? Do we not know what this is? And it would help us, I think, gauge how, you know, where we're going with the talk a little bit.
Yeah, but we can, I think we. Okay, there's a lot of, I do not know what it is. I can see that. Okay. Well, let's talk about this for what this system is. And it can be used in all kind of greenhouses. It's basically a way to, in the daytime, and especially very helpful in the winter, to pull air when the sun is shining, warm air out of the greenhouse, send it through a fan into the ground. In the ground, the air cools down and the ground heats up. And so in the daytime, you're basically cooling the air inside the greenhouse and you're heating the soil. And then at nighttime, when it gets cold outside, and that's in the next slide, you basically take the cool air from inside the greenhouse because it's getting cool. By now, your ground is warm, and so the warm air is then dispensed into the greenhouse. So it's kind of a low-cost way to heat your greenhouse. And it works basically on two fronts. One of them is this daily, input of energy and take it in the daytime and taking it out at night. But the soil itself has a temperature that in general is probably around the average temperature of the year in your location. And so in most places in the US, that turns out to be somewhere in the range of 50 degrees. And so that 50-degree soil temperature allows you to have the temperature, that's the outgoing temperature of the GAHT system at nighttime, even on cold and cloudy days. And that in many places helps you certainly to keep your greenhouse above freezing. So That's what a GAHT system is, and that's what it does. Very simple, very, very simple. And it's a useful thing in a high tunnel. I see some of the comments. Easy way to install it. You can see it on the left. You have a big manifold. You have little, usually we use 4-inch pipes connecting to another manifold on the other side. And then you get the system. Here you see it with soil in between. Usually we pull the air from the high side. We tend to do that in our greenhouses, often on the north side of the greenhouse. We're expelling it on the south side. When you have a solid building, if you have a high tunnel, you want to be sure to pull the air from as high up as you can, and you want to expel it somewhere low. In this case, it looks like the expelled air is going straight up. It's not quite ideal. You want to keep it close to the ground so that you get the warmer air to go closer to where your plants are. You don't need to heat the air up. And so the other thing you can see in this bigger greenhouse, which is a big facility, 70 feet from north to south and whatever, 120 feet long. You can have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different GAHT systems in this one facility. In the picture below, you can see the air coming out of those pipes, and you can see the hair of my friends flying in the air. So we're not talking about a gentle little airflow. We're talking quite a bit of air that is moved through that system in order for it to be effective. Josh, I think you can go to the next one. We have seen this. You can see the fan on the left side. That's
Mark,
quite a hefty fan.
I was going to say that we tend to install this in 3 layers. So it's kind of an install, backfill, install routine. Mm-hmm. And so we get hopefully deeper than 4 feet, maybe on the lowest level, and then up to 2 feet or 18 inches below the surface of the soil.
Right. And so when you install that, and so now I think the next slide, I wanted to just go a little bit about what you can see. For example, here's a greenhouse in Denver. You can see the outside temperature in the lower graph, which is in this particular night went all the way to 28 degrees or something. That's the lower graph. And you can see the greenhouse temperature is the line that is above. That's the whatever turquoise or so. And it was set, I think, at 55 degrees or so. And then you can see the evening starting, on the left side of the picture, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, the sun is going down, the temperature starts dropping until it gets to the 55-degree mark. And then the GAHT system comes on for a short bit. You can see these little green, dark green pictures, and you can see that it keeps the temperature stable, and it just keeps it stable all over. This is in a tomato greenhouse, so he did not want to be anywhere close to 50 degrees. So the GAHT system in this case kept the greenhouse nicely at 55 degrees. But you can see as the longer the night goes, the more runtime is required for that system to work until sometime in the morning, the sun comes back up and the system starts cooling again, right? So now it starts for a while. It doesn't run between 55 and about 70 or so. It doesn't run, and then it starts cooling. And so then it starts cooling for a while. And then it goes to another day. Just so you get a feel for what is possible. Now, in this particular case, this GAHT system, because it's a relatively energy efficient greenhouse, does a very wonderful way to keep the greenhouse at 55 degrees so that he can grow tomatoes on it. If you're talking about a regular high tunnel, 55 degrees are not a reasonable goal for all winter long in New Hampshire. Now, that may be different in North Carolina, where we do these GAHT systems. I've seen a lot of North Carolinians. I went to school there, so yes, hey. But in other places in the South, that works very well as well. So are there questions to that particular functioning? And while maybe you can go to the next one, Josh.
Mark,
and
I was going to go back real quick to show this photo, which is in Madison, Wisconsin. Now, again, this is a more insulated greenhouse, which is more our traditional. So it's a little beyond, the envelope is a little beyond what a high tunnel can do. But she's a market farmer, organic farm, 5 acres. This is in the summer. She gets a little jump start, everyone, because she plants cucumbers in February. But she's able to produce lettuce all winter with no heat in Madison, Wisconsin. Now, as Jonathan was saying, she uses only the GAHT. So she can't really control it. It's not set to 65. So it's usually around 50 to 55 on the low end, maybe 45. So she grows lettuce, and slowly she's growing though. And she can't always say you're going to have a weekly delivery, but she does maintain a winter business with just the GAHT system heating the greenhouse.
And so then I wrote down a few places where we feel like the GAHT is a really good option. You see our jokester client in Ontario. He's growing really good lettuce in the winter. The GAHT system is a major part of the heating system. They also, in his particular greenhouse, he also has artificial lights because he has a schedule that he has to keep. And so he has to have supermarkets, etc., that he is delivering to. So the GAHT system is really good in sunny and cold locations when plants want temperatures around 50 degrees or less. That's ideal. When the heating is more needed than cooling, so in general, the GAHT is not the most efficient way to cool a greenhouse that is in Louisiana at outside temperatures 95 degrees, all summer long. The GAHT system is simply overpowered. The soil is not going to hold that heat very well. The GAHT system is really helpful when you don't want to use fossil fuels for heating. What you're trying to do is use electricity, and then the idea is you can go to some kind of a net zero story by having solar PV, etc. So this is where the GAHT system is really, really good. A lot of the places in the Northeast have issues where you want to have greenhouses that use electric more or is preferred to fossil fuels. Generally, moist soils are a plus because you get a much better heat transfer. It is also good for a good part of the winter when some people really prefer to add CO2 to their greenhouse because the greenhouse can basically be sealed, right? So it cools enough so you don't actually have to vent, so the greenhouse can stay that way. Now, I know in most high tunnels that's not a thing. I'm just going to put it out there and say, well, that's something you can think about in the winter. People talk about groundwater a lot. If you have more than 2 feet or 2 feet, so soil, that's really enough. I mean, you can go all the way down to 4 feet and lower if you want, but an occasional flooding because of excessive rain is not an issue. The GAHT system will clear out again. Groundwater is generally not an issue. And I think as a general idea, if you want to know what your ground temperature is, just look at your average outdoor temperature of the year, and most likely that's kind of the temperature that your outdoor soil is going to be. And that's the soil that will feed the GAHT system even if no sun is shining. And in most of the US, in the coldest it ever gets is 45. Many places get up to 60, but somewhere in between is the normal range, and the GAHT system works really well in that. So most people, I would say, have 50, 55 are good numbers. And those are great numbers to keep a GAHT. Not maybe enough for heating tomatoes necessarily, but almost everything else. And then I have a graph where is the GAHT not that great. Even though I show you some cool pictures on the left, we can talk about that in a minute. So if you only want to do cooling, you have a facility, again, as I said, Florida, whatever, most of the year, you're only looking at that for cooling. The GAHT is overwhelmed. When you want temperatures inside the greenhouse that are above 60, the GAHT is not great because very few places the soil is at above 60, so that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Off-grid locations where you need to basically use stored electricity at night, the GAHT runs the most at night. Those fans draw some electricity. It's off-grid, the GAHT is not great because the battery usage is quite, these fans do draw some power. I'm saying here with very inefficient greenhouses, Jonathan talked about that, when you have a greenhouse that's leaking and all of that, your soil is trying really hard to heat your greenhouse. And if all you're doing is you're losing air left and right and everywhere, it's not worth doing. I mean, seal up your greenhouse, make it double inflated, because you basically want heating. I think you want an inflated greenhouse. That would make sense. The permafrost locations, not great for obvious reasons. It's just simply too cold. Then on the other side, when the ground temperature above 70, which happens on the Caribbean islands and all of that, like, oh, we want to use that. Yeah, well, very few plants get cooled enough at temperatures of the ground that are above 70. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense. For most people to know, dry sands and rocks are not ideal for ideal ground material. So you want to replace it with something else. That's mostly because the thermal mass is high, but the conductivity is really low. And what you need for a GAHT system to work really well is conductive soil. And the last thing I'm saying is heating. You can't really heat the greenhouse using fossil fuels and ran the GAHT at the same time, because what you're doing is you're putting heat in there with less of propane heater, and then you're taking that heat and you're pumping it in the soil. That's just not an efficient way to do that. So usually once you start heating, I recommend turning off the GAHT system. You can use the heating much less, but you don't want to use it at the same time.
One place where we find the GAHT to be incredibly effective is in winter locations where they're sunny.
Yeah.
The GAHT can cool the greenhouse very well in the winter when it's cold outside, but the greenhouse is slightly overheating. And so we often try to integrate a GAHT system into those greenhouses in sunny, cold places. Because you're heating the soil, you cool the greenhouse ambient, you cool the greenhouse air all day, which is needed, while you're heating the soil all day, which you can then use to reheat at night. So sunny locations are great that are cool. The change in temperature day to night is good. I also wanted to say, because Mark was discussing groundwater, we didn't mention it. The 4-inch pipes are perforated. So the entire system is a drain. People often ask, what about mold? I'm worried about mold. You're blowing mold all over my greenhouse. And we find that with the airflow and the perforations, there's no mold in the system. Somehow, with a study from a university, it's actually decreasing mold levels in the air, but who knows why, but it is a drain. It can fill with water. It will drain of water once groundwater goes down again. We see it. So it's a very cool, versatile system. that we see people who don't need total environmental control of their greenhouse used very effectively, both for fun and for market farmers.
And that's,
We
I think,
also,
all I wanted to say about the GAHT system, right? So,
okay, and then we put together a little quickie about, we're trying to, our work is always a little bit pushing the limits of what we're doing, and there's a major, maybe like a thought divide, because there's a very cheap way to do things, and a hoop house is an effective and cheap and sometimes free with, you know, USDA NRCS grants to extend the season. And then there's like highly effective ways to do things which cost money but work really well and eliminate some of the issues. And we've been working on, actually with an organization in the Northeast, to develop a less expensive greenhouse, but a greenhouse, so beyond a high tunnel, for year-round growing, to kind of change a farm's revenue stream and mindset a little bit. And so we have a few slides that we want to just introduce, mostly just get creative juices flowing. There's a concept here that with the organization that there might be some long-term financing available that actually makes it affordable for a farmer. You know, this is in development, but we just wanted to introduce this thing. It is in development. It will be a package, whenever it comes, but it will be like a thing. We're not going to make a lot of adjustments to it. This is a green, you know, we're talking about a greenhouse now. But we're thinking about energy usage, operating expenses, all those kinds of things. So double roof vent, and there will be some sort of south wall, low wall intake. These will be motorized rack and pinion. We don't want this thing, we call it a new puppy. We don't want it to be a new puppy where you have to be with it all the time. We actually want, you don't have to wake up at 7 a.m. to open a vent. It's going to open a vent. If it's hot or cold, there's a big temperature swing, it's going to deal with it. You don't have to freak out. You don't have to stay home. You're not running anywhere unless you want to be running somewhere. We have a glazing option that is called ETFE, we'll talk about next, and we kind of alluded to it earlier. But it is a highlight transmissive, long-term UV transmissive glazing that does all kinds of weird things that you're not used to, that we'll talk about in a second. We have integrated a smart controller into the greenhouse. So now if you're at home, you can change a set point without going out to the greenhouse. You can graph the data. You can call us and say, what's going on with this thing? And then we say, oh, let's adjust the set point, Mark, probably at 2 a.m. Changes the set point, and he's like, oh, look, I think we gained 6% efficiency. There's like a bottom line aspect to this that we don't get with a cheaper structure that we can get with a more advanced control system. Like the roof vent, there's no, you know, we're trying to not use exhaust fans on the daily because that's expensive. So the roof vent allows for natural ventilation. Double shade energy curtain does the same. It's next to no electricity. It opens or closes and then just sits there. And so in the summer, we can shade with an open weave fabric that still lets heat out. And in the winter, we can close a second fabric that's actually an energy curtain that has a strange way of saying how effective it is, but they're potentially 50% or more. They hold in 50% more heat than what just the open glazing would do. It's a blanket. It's on the inside of the greenhouse. It just opens and closes. So basically allows us to let sunlight in as we want during the day, or shades we want during the day. If it's cold at night, close it up and create a nice little tight blanket. We also have the option, depending on where we are, to use infrared blocking films. So we can either do this like in the Northeast. In the winter, we want heat to come into the greenhouse. So we wouldn't glaze the whole structure with an IR blocking film, but you'd never get warm in the greenhouse. It would be a total bummer. But we can put it on a shade system mechanism, and we can deploy it in the summer if we wanted to reduce heat in the greenhouse. It reflects the heat back out. And we can close it at night to hold heat in. In warm places, we work on tropical greenhouses or some Middle East projects. we might use an infrared blocking film on the outside of the greenhouse because it's always hot and we never need that heat to come in the greenhouse. And then depending on timing, again, if you're growing lettuce and you need 28 days, you need lights. And so we often will integrate lights into this. But again, this is like a farm package that is designed for production. Contrary to what Jonathan showed you with the controller, this is the controller that we build. I can assure you that it's a lot more expensive. So wah wah there, you know, of course. But it also does different things. So this is what a new controller looks like. And it allows us, you saw it before, but it allows us to do this. And we can track whatever we want to track. We can control whatever we want to control. And we can learn and get better over time once it's installed and commissioned.
There's a couple of quick questions in the chat, so I just wanted to interrupt. One person was just asking where their Oprah survey is. Thank you for asking where your Oprah survey is. The survey should pop up when you exit the webinar. So when you exit, like on your browser, it should pop up as long as I did everything right. And if I didn't, I will be emailing you out the survey tomorrow. So thank you to everyone who fills out the survey. Oprah thanks you, and I thank you. There's a question from Joseph that is the design somewhere that they can analyze it? And then I see a hand raised from Stephanie, I think, as well.
Stephanie. Well, the design is in progress and will be somewhere that it can be analyzed. I mean, once it's done, it will be like on our website, and it'll be a thing that will be and can be picked apart.
And they were asking as well about if you could describe the end wall.
If I can describe the end wall?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's uncertain what we're going to be offering, but what you see here, this is an insulated metal panel. So it's actually steel, foam steel. Depending on our heat loss calculations, it's a 2 or 3 inch panel, which is an R16 or an R24. These are designed, the farmer's greenhouse in general is designed for cold climates. It works in a lot of places, but it's really designed for cold climates. We try and take into account how the outside weather is and the amount of sunlight that we need. And we try and find an appropriate balance between insulation and glazing, which is delicate, but effective.
And cost.
And expensive.
And
but
cost.
again, we're trying
we need to make sure that, I mean, it makes sense to use polycarbonate as well if that's appropriate, right? I mean, it's multi-layer polycarbonate. I mean, this is a question of what do you want to grow in which location. That is a discussion that's easily to be had.
Yeah. Again, this is really like just getting the juices flowing, and just like 2 more slides, we'll be done. This is ETFE glazing. It's ethyl tetrafluoroethylene or something. We call it ETFE. But highly transmissive, UV transmissive. We were talking about powdery mildew. We were talking about pests. We were talking about all that earlier. ETFE is a UV transmissive film that doesn't degrade. It changes an indoor garden. So your standard hoop house film has a UV blocker on it. And the reason that it degrades over 4 years is because of UV light and kind of its construction. This Mark's a chemical engineer. You know, we are saying 30 years, but like maybe longer. But it lets UV light in and it changes your garden. You're not fighting mildews like you were, maybe not at all, but definitely not like you were. You don't fight pests like you were. They don't like UV. And it is a natural deterrent against all that stuff. This particular photo, I realize this structure is totally over robust for what we're talking about, but it is a full garden at probably 8,000 feet in Colorado under ETFE. And mostly what I want you to see is when you look out that end wall, it looks pretty clear. This is a triple layer ETFE installation, which is just crazy. Just how clear the film is. The roof is diffuse. You'll see no shadows in the greenhouse. The end walls are clear. It's more expensive than polyfilm. like a lot more expensive than polyfilm. It is very effective for growing. Your plants are happier. You yield more. They have better taste. I have all these, but we have installed it on hoop houses. It likes to be installed under tension, but it can be inflated. It is basically hail resistant. It's an insurance. It's a bit of an insurance policy. It will pockmark, but with heat, you can kind of delete a hail mark. And then why?
Class A fire rated, right?
Yeah. And then a quick why is we get all this feedback about I'd like the farm to be a year-round farm. I'd like to retain my farm manager for the year. I keep losing my farm manager, and we're building out a system where you can grow in this greenhouse year-round and produce revenue for the farm year-round. Retaining clients through the year, either through a winter CSA or providing wholesale for your restaurants, keeps your clients with you as opposed to people jumping around from farm to farm from year to year once they have that winter pause and maybe they want to try something new. And then Mark's favorite thing is graphs. And with data, which I can't read graphs like Mark can read graphs, but we can get a lot better at growing. We can become way more efficient and we can push yields just by changing how we're using the equipment that we've already purchased. And that's a kind of fun thing to play with once the greenhouses are built. So I think that's the end of what we have going on. So I think I'll stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark and Josh. I keep going to too many J names tonight. But yeah, thank you. That was very fun. It's fun to see the kind of limits that you can push greenhouses to. Got about 9 more minutes. So if anyone has any lingering thoughts or questions or ideas, you can either come off mute and ask them or drop them in the chat, and I'm happy to read them out. And again, because I haven't mentioned it in the last 5 seconds, please fill out the survey at the end. It's very helpful. It makes me happy to see all the surveys come in. They are anonymous and they help us help you. And you can also let us know what you want to learn about managing pests in greenhouses, because our next workshop will be about pests in greenhouses in high tunnels. See, I'm seeing a thank you in the chat. I'm not seeing any questions.
Curious about price difference between the traditional poly covering for the tunnels and the new material that was just shown that can last 30 years and has all the miraculous benefits.
It is kind of miraculous. The price difference is significant. Depending on how you install it. So ETFE in its most robust installation is actually installed under significant tension. So it's like a drum. And we have a track that is every 3 to 5 feet that creates the tension as you install it. With that system, it's up to $14 a square foot for a single layer. So it's significant. But a double layer inflated film would be slightly cheaper because there's way less metal involved. It's more like, it's not wiggle wire, but it's just a lot less stuff and then air in the middle. But I think, we $14 a square foot. We're bringing it from Japan and Germany. There's a lot going on there.
So it has specialized hardware. It's not like a DIY install.
Yeah. I mean, Mark, you can speak to that. We've installed it with wiggle wire and it went okay.
I mean, it depends on where you're located. The locations that we did it first was a community college with over 100 mile/hour wind on a regular. It is a little more slippery than normal polyfilm, slightly thinner. So the regular wiggle wire was becoming somewhat loose and needed to be retensioned. But that is a problem that was a particular problem at this location. That wouldn't be the case for most people in the US. You don't see 100 mile/hour winds every day, or not 6 times a year. So I think wiggle wire installations will probably work just fine. and then the price comes down, and there you really don't need extra equipment. You just want to use coated wiggle wire, not the, but most people use that already anyway.
Do y'all have
Okay.
any like tutorials or anything that people could watch on installation or tips on? Because we just kind of like tie tennis balls to and, like throw it over, to the other side. It sounds like it might be a little more delicate than the traditional from
No,
the
it's actually
consumer.
not. It's quite very robust material, so it would probably be just the same. The people that installed it were doing exactly the same thing that you were doing, so that's not really an issue. And reach out to us, and we can give you a price. It depends if you want it with non-drip coatings and all those kind of things that increase the price a little bit or not. Those are kind of things. I think you have a chance to reach out to us, do that, and we'll walk you through it and what's necessary. But it is possible on hoop houses to do without using anything extra beside the film, and then the price is significantly lower than what Josh was indicating. Josh's price is one with the specialized installation hardware.
Thank you.
There's another question in the chat. Does evaporative cooling increase disease pressure?
Well, so we tend to be doing it during the heat of the day. So a lot of that's mitigated. And we're exhausting as we're like if you're using an evaporative pad, the way we use that is we're running that exhaust and pulling the air across sort of this trickle of water. So a lot of that humidity that we're generating actually gets blown out of the house anyway. So if I'm going to zoom out for a second and say, like, everything we've been talking about tonight is a tool, right? And so we need to really ask, what do I want to accomplish? And then what's the best tool to do that? And then we say, okay, well, then what's the best tool I can afford to do that with, right? And so if you need an evaporative cooling system, then it's going to be because the damage of not having one is significant, right? Or is something that you're willing to spend money and energy, and there's a lot of maintenance on evaporative cooling. And so you're going to be in a situation where you're willing to take some of that trade-off because of the cooling that it affects for you. But not a ton on disease pressure. They get nasty. I mean, they call them swamp coolers, right? So I mean, we have to keep them clean themselves.
And maybe we can add, we usually put insects screens on the outside of the wet wall, build a box around it so that at least you don't suck insects in that way. You can do that too.
Great. There's one more question, and then if there's any other last questions, we might have time for one more question after that. This one is maybe a quick one. Will a white shade cloth cool better because it reflects light?
Do you want me to take that? Do you want to take that,
We
Josh?
we only use white shade cloth, so that's our experience.
Yeah, it reflects light and it lets like a better spectrum through. We didn't talk about spectrum at all tonight, but it lets a better spectrum through, whereas a black shade cloth sort of absorbs it and turns it into heat. I think y'all down south are probably more likely to use white shade cloth. Black shade cloth is just kind of standard issue up here in the north. But yes, yeah, it does cool better, and it does
Jonathan,
reflect.
can I ask, what do you think about pink shade cloth?
I haven't used it.
Okay, there is a whole idea about the pink shade cloth I see all over the world that particularly changed the spectrum more to the infrared, and so they believe they're touting it as much better for the plants, and it certainly looks pink.
And it makes sense, right? So I mean, the idea is if you're transmitting the wavelengths that are useful for photosynthesis. Of course, those are
Yeah.
going to look pink. And if you're reflecting off the ones that the plant, either the black shade cloth would turn them into heat, or the plant would turn them into heat, or whatever else would turn them into heat, it makes sense. I just haven't seen anybody who's justified that tool yet in New Hampshire.
There's also a comment from Stephanie in Georgia who said she's never actually seen white shade cloths and that her old boss just used to drape the black shade cloth over T-post to shade the pepper rose.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah. All right. So we're at 7:59. Thank you so much, Mark and Jonathan and Josh, for presenting tonight. It's been really informative. Thank you all for coming and listening, and thank you all for filling out surveys. That's all I've got for tonight. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
Thanks, y'all.
thank you. I'm seeing some thank yous in the chat. Oh, thank you guys.
Would you like me to stick around, Emily, or am I signing off?